So where do we start? Well, I want to start with a quote from Richard Dawkins. Okay, if you're not familiar with Richard Dawkins, he's one of the leading atheists in the world today. Okay, he's written The God Delusion, that was arguing for atheism and against theism. But he's also recently written a book in 2009 called The Greatest Show on Earth. Now, 2009 was a big year for evolution because it was the 200th anniversary of Charles Darwin's birth. And it was also the 150th anniversary of the publication of his book on the origin of species in 1859. And so in Dawkins' book, The Greatest Show on Earth, in the opening pages, he says this: evolution is a fact, beyond reasonable doubt, beyond serious doubt, beyond sane, informed, intelligent doubt. Beyond doubt, evolution is a fact. The evidence for evolution is at least as strong as the evidence for the Holocaust. Okay, these are really powerful words. Jerry Coyne, a fellow atheist, a professor of biology at the University of Chicago, opens his book, also written in 2009, called Why Evolution is True, with these words. He says, evolution is a fact. And far from casting doubt on Darwinism, the evidence gathered by scientists over the past century and a half support it completely. Okay, very powerful words. Now Dawkins goes, very Dawkins-esque, he goes a step further. He actually said, and this is actually going back to 1989, he says this in a book review. He says, it's absolutely safe to say, if you meet someone who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that. So here, now, I joke, so let's take a poll. Who doesn't believe in evolution? You know, after seeing these words, who would want to admit that they don't believe in evolution? You know, you're like a Holocaust denier, according to Dawkins, okay? And so what do you do with words like this? Well, there are some theists, some Christians, who are feeling the weight of these claims and the pressure to conform to the scientific majority. The majority does believe in evolution. And so sadly, they're doing whatever they can to kind of capitulate to this view. In fact, there's been a whole host of books that have been written, and I've just put up 3. And the argument is, from these books, is to show there's no incompatibility between evolution and Christianity. So you have Ken Miller, a textbook author. He's a Roman Catholic. He argues for the compatibility of evolution and Christianity in his book, Finding Darwin's God. Carl Giberson, he's a physicist. He argues for the same conclusion, the same thesis in Saving Darwin. And then the language of God, which is actually an argument for theism, but Francis Collins, who is a very famous Christian. In fact, he was the head of the Human Genome Project. Okay? He's a doctor and geneticist. He's written the language of God and makes the same argument. And so you have these groups arguing for theistic evolution. Now, sometimes it goes under the name evolutionary creation. Sometimes it's called fully gifted creation. Sometimes it's called biologos. I'm going to kind of put these all together as theistic evolution. Okay? And I realize that these individuals differ in their views in some respects, but I want to just broadly speak of theistic evolution. In addition to these books, there's actually been organizations founded for the sole purpose of convincing Christians that we should embrace evolution. The BioLogos Foundation is one such organization. They have a website, biologos.com, if you want to check that out. Now, Al Mohler, the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, puts his finger on what's driving the theistic evolutionists at BioLogos. He says, the BioLogos approach to the issue is now clear. They want to discredit evangelical objections to evolution and to convince the evangelical public that an acceptance of evolution is a means of furthering the gospel. They have leveled their guns against the intelligent design movement, at young earth creationism, and against virtually all resistance to the embrace of evolution. They claim that the embrace of evolution is necessary if evangelicalism is not to be intellectually marginalized in the larger culture. They have warned that a refusal to embrace evolution will doom evangelicalism to the status of an intellectual cult. Okay? So you need to embrace this, or you're going to end up being pushed to the wayside. Now, today we're going to look at this question: are evolution and Christianity compatible? And if so, should Christians embrace evolution? You don't have to be in the evangelical world very long to realize that this is one of the biggest questions on the forefront of our culture. Books have come out. These were bestsellers or books of the year in 2011, God and Evolution, and Should Christians Embrace Evolution? I'd strongly recommend both of those books. Also, within the past year and a half, Christianity Today has featured two, actually, cover stories. One was on the historical atom. The other one, this was actually this summer, was The Tale of Two Scientists. It actually featured a young Earth creationist and a theistic evolutionist. Okay? So this topic we're talking about is kind of at the forefront of evangelicalism. And listen, how you answer the question, should Christians embrace evolution, will either label you as a heretic or as a fundamentalist. And that's not what I'm going to do today, okay? I just want to throw the arguments out there and we can have a discussion afterwards. So before I begin my talk, before I can answer this question, or try to, we need to answer the question, what is evolution? Or what do we mean by evolution, okay? Richard Dawkins says it's a fact. So what is he talking about? Well, we've got to define evolution. So evolution is an equivocal word. That is, it has more than one meaning, okay? And it can be very slippery when you get into conversations with people because they might have a definition in mind that you don't have in your mind. So let's just look at some of them. First, the uncontroversial definitions. Change over time. You know, my Corvette, or the Corvette evolved. I don't have a Corvette. I wish I did. But it's changed over time. We could say it evolved. That has nothing to do with biology. So things change. Even the book of Genesis, even if you're a young Earth creationist, talks about change. Change in gene frequency in a population, again, that's not controversial. Everyone believes that. Limited common descent, again, the Bible teaches that if you're a young Earth creationist, you believe that the animals were created after their kind, then sure, all dogs came from two dogs. All humans came from a pair of humans. Okay, so that's limited common descent. And the mechanism of natural selection, random mutation, we see those happen all the time, which I'll illustrate. Those aren't controversial, okay? Everyone believes those. So in that sense, evolution is a fact, okay? Now here's what is more controversial, okay? Universal common descent, that is that all of the organisms on the face of the planet came from a single universal common ancestor. And then this one, and this is the definition that you're going to see most in textbooks and what Richard Dawkins argues for. Richard Dawkins called it the blind watchmaker thesis. This is Neo-Darwinian evolution, okay? And it basically says that all organisms are descended from a common ancestor, but it's solely through unguided, unintelligent, purposeless material processes such as natural selection and random mutation, okay? This part is crucial to the definition, as I'll show you. Now, these go under the label microevolution, and these would go under a label macroevolution, okay? I realize I'm going to fly through some slides here, so if you can't take good notes, we're shooting a video here, so I'm hoping that'll be on and you can watch that again. So I apologize for kind of flying through this. Now, that definition, the blind watchmaker thesis, that is what I believe is incompatible with Christianity. But it's the definition that the scientists use, okay? In fact, the experts, 39 Nobel laureates, wrote to the Kansas State Board of Education in 2005. And they actually defined evolution this way. They said, evolution is understood to be the result of unguided, unplanned process of random variation, random mutations, and natural selection. Ken Miller, remember I talked about Kenneth Miller. He wrote Finding Darwin's God. In his textbook, in fact, in the States, 40% of the textbooks that are used in high schools are Ken Miller's textbook, the Miller-Levine textbook. And he says in his textbook, evolution works without either plan or purpose. Evolution is random and undirected. And there's other quotes I'd have to fill these slides, so we'll just leave it there. Now here's my logical argument against theistic evolution. It would look like this. To ask the question, can God use Darwinian evolution or Neo-Darwinian evolution, is the same as asking, can God guide an unguided process? I would argue that that's a contradiction in terms. to ask, can God direct an undirected process, or can God plan an unplanned process, is a contradiction. It violates the law of non-contradiction. And so it's logically incoherent, okay? And so here's the dilemma. We have, it's either guided or it's unguided, the law of excluded middle. But if evolution is guided, then Neo-Darwinian evolution is false. As I just described it, as the scientists describe evolution, it would be false, okay? Because then you'd have to say, well, no, it's not guided. We'd have to say, no, the definition is it's guided, it's planned, it's intelligent. If evolution is unguided, then God had no part in guiding it, okay? So I see this as violating the law of non-contradiction. The idea of theistic evolution violates this law. The law states that you can't have A and not A at the same time and in the same sense. There's a philosopher, a Muslim philosopher named Avicenna, in the 11th century. He said, if anyone denies the law of non-contradiction, should be beaten and burned until he admits that to be beaten is not the same as not to be beaten, and to be burned is not the same as not to be burned. Okay? I spoke with a pastor. He was going to invite me to speak at his church, not on this subject. And we sat down at Tim Hortons, and it turns out he didn't want to invite me to his church. He wanted to debate me. And he said, there's no such thing as truth. This is a pastor at a very large church, actually, in Newmarket. And he said, you can't actually tell people that Christianity is true. They don't believe in truth. There is no truth. And then we started getting into logic, and he's like, you're using Western law. And it turns out he didn't want to invite me to his church. He wanted to debate me. And he said, there's no such thing as truth. This is a pastor at a very large church, actually, in Newmarket. And he said, you can't actually tell people that Christianity is true. They don't believe in truth. There is no truth. And then we started getting into logic, and he's like, you're using Western logic as opposed to Eastern logic. And we just got into a big thing, and I went Rabbi Zacharias on him with an illustration. I won't go into it. So Kenneth Miller actually understands the contradiction. Evolutionary biologist, textbook author Ken Miller, he sees it. And he actually writes in his book, Miller insists that mankind's appearance on the planet was not preordained. That we are here as an afterthought, a minor detail, a happenstance in history that might just as well have left us out. Okay, he gets it. It's unguided. Okay? Kenneth Miller. He actually goes on to say at a conference, not in his book, he says that evolution is so undirected that it could have produced big-brain dinosaurs or a mollusk like a snail with exceptional mental capabilities rather than human beings. Okay? That's what he says. So he understands the contradiction. In fact, I think Richard Dawkins understands the contradiction. He says in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, that although atheism might have been logically tenable before Darwin, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Okay? He saw the incompatibility between God and this unguided process. So he gets it too. An undirected natural process doesn't need God, nor is it even compatible with God as a creator or designer. Okay? In this book, Wayne Grudem kind of opens the book with the preface, and he says, to put it in terms of an equation, when atheists assure us that matter plus evolution plus nothing, or zero, equals all living things, and then theistic evolutionists answer no, that matter plus evolution plus God equals all living things, it will not take long for unbelievers to conclude that, therefore God equals zero. God equals nothing. Actually, this reminds me of the instructions to boil water. Do you guys know how to boil water? Let me show you. The instructions to boil water. First, you place water in a bowl and put it on a heat source. And then you raise the temperature to 100 degrees Celsius. And then you add a leprechaun. That's how you boil water. And then you throw them in there. Okay, jumps in. Now, you guys all know you don't boil water with a leprechaun. You don't need it. It's unnecessary. That's right. Adding a leprechaun is superfluous because these two things, by leprechaun, he went up in smoke. These are unnecessary. It's unnecessary. And I would argue the same way. God, on this view, it would be unnecessary, okay? Because evolution can do it itself. And Kenneth Miller would agree with that. Now, I want to look at, now, maybe you don't agree with my logical argument, but let's look at the scientific argument. I think this is where a lot of the weight lies, for me at least. So here are some evidences that I find, or things that I find that don't add up for the more controversial definition for evolution. So if it turns out that there's serious scientific problems for the theory of evolution, then Christians don't need to add it to their theology, okay? Which I think is what a lot of people are doing. They're feeling that pressure, and they're doing that. So remember, there's two types of evolution, micro and macro. Let's look at the evidence for macroevolution. Now, macroevolution has these two pillars. I've already mentioned them before, so we'll pass that. You can boil the first pillar down to the tree of life, okay? All organisms came from a single common ancestor we call the tree of life. Morphology is just a change in body features over time going up here. And so we have our single protist at the beginning here, and then we have all life today, okay? So that's the tree of life. This is vertical change. This is the goo to you via the zoo evolution. This is how they describe it. Now, as a creationist, I believe in kind of an orchard of life, okay? The creation orchard of life, that is, God creates individual organisms, and this would be horizontal change. So all the dogs came from two dogs, and you get all the dogs we see today. So I don't believe in stasis. There's a lot of misconception out there that that creationists don't believe that animals change. And so you'd have this idea where different organisms are related to within a kind, okay? So we have to beware of a common bait and switch, okay? When you're looking for evidence for evolution, now I teach high school biology as well as physics, and you got to be careful when you ask someone for evidence for evolution that they don't give you micro and then as evidence for macro, okay? Because all the microevolution in the world, I will show you, at least I'll argue, doesn't add up to macroevolution, okay? And there's a good reason for that. And this is a bait and switch. They'll say, of course I believe in evolution, referring to the tree of life. I see evolution happen all the time. And they talk about dogs changing, okay? Which is actually artificial selection, which is intelligently designed. So let's look at this together, okay? The first one we're going to look at is, because some of you might be out of the biology classroom for a little while, or maybe some of you take biology here. Kind of a grade 11, or maybe it's first semester here, I don't know, is genetics. Natural selection is often used as evidence for evolution. So I'm going to describe how natural selection works as simply as I can. So you inherit genes from your mother and your father. That's how it works. These are called alleles. You actually have one allele from your mom, one allele from your dad. And we'll say that this gentleman here has a gene for short hair, that's this gene, and long hair. And his wife, has a short hair gene and a long hair gene. So what ends up happening is, if they get married and have kids, because they got to get married first, you could get a short hair gene from dad, a short haired from mom, and your offspring is going to have short hair. Okay? And I got a Punnett square going over here, but we'll just leave that out for now. We don't overcomplicate things. Turns out, when you have incomplete dominance, you can actually have genes that have a combining effect. And so it's often described in textbooks with these snapdragon plants. A red and a white will make pink. Well, similarly, the short-haired gene here and the long-haired gene are going to make a medium-haired dog. And here we have this other dog, and he's got medium hair. And then this guy over here, terrible hair day, he's got a long-haired gene from mom and dad. Now, you want to see natural selection in action? We take these dogs and we drop them off in Antarctica or something, okay? And we see how they survive. It turns out, oh, it's so sad, these two guys died. Yeah, they couldn't survive. Their hair wasn't long enough. The fur wasn't long enough. If this guy can send out the vibe, PJ, and he finds a mate, then when they have kids, guess what? They're all going to be long-haired. And this is a textbook example of natural selection. And, but notice what happened here. It's very, very important that you realize that we actually lost genetic information, okay? We lost genetic information. And for evolution to work, you need to actually increase the amount of genetic information in your genome, okay? And to make new functions, to make things like eyes and ears and when things don't have those features, okay? So we need an increase in information, not a loss. So this would not be a good example for macroevolution. Now there's been, over the years, a number of examples that people have used for evolution. One's peppered moss. This is still used in textbooks today, although it's come under fire. Was it a hoax? Were the moths just nailed to the trees, pinned to the trees? Let's just assume that the thing works, okay? And there's no problem with it. It actually occurs. What happened is, there was these moths, peppered moths, and they would land on these trees. And the trees were light colored. And they had lichen on them. And so there's actually a moth right here, okay? Very hard to see. And so the birds couldn't see the moth either. So when they would go hunting for food, they would take out the black moths. Now what happened was, the Industrial Revolution came along in England, and the pollution actually covered the trees with black soot and killed the lichen. And so what you were left with was the black moth being camouflaged and the white moth being exposed. So here's what happened. The population of white moths, which was really high and black was low, just kind of switched, okay? And so now we have a lot of black moths and less white ones. A population switch. And this is often used as evidence for evolution. But notice, both moths existed before this happened and after this happened. So it's just a population change. And actually, today, because the pollution has gone down, the trees are starting to go light again and the population is changing again. So again, I don't think this is a good candidate for macroevolution. Another one is Finch Beaks. Darwin went to the Galapagos Islands and he discovered that there was these finches, and he saw that, hey, maybe these all came from a common finch. And through his extrapolation, he saw that, and through his extrapolation, he thought, hey, maybe this is evidence for evolution, that in millions of years, these finches might evolve into something else. And so we've done many studies since then. And we found that, yes, actually the beak size does grow. And in certain climates, when there's a drought, for example, the bigger beaked birds will actually survive because they can crack into the nuts to get their food, whereas the smaller beaks can't do that. And so they die out. And so there was a 5% increase in beak size. Some scientists found this. Very intriguing study, okay? And then but then when the drought was gone, and actually the population went back. And so again, what's really gone on here? And I would argue that for you to make the extravagant claim that all organisms are descended from a common single-celled ancestor, you need more evidence than this, okay? And so this isn't going to do the trick. So I should also point out that was natural selection, and natural selection doesn't create. What it does is it selects. It selects from your gene pool, okay? It doesn't create anything. And so what does create? Well, if you go to the University of Berkeley website, they have, and I encourage you to do that, there's a whole site devoted to understanding evolution. In fact, it's called Understanding Evolution. And I've read almost every page, if not every page of the site. And I found this quote. It said, "Mutations are essential to evolution. They are the raw material for genetic variation. Without mutations, evolution could not occur." This is the engine that drives evolution. It's the variation that Charles Darwin hypothesized right from the beginning. Now we call it not Darwinism, but Neo-Darwinism, because we realize that it is mutations that cause the variation. Now, most mutations are harmful, about 99% of them, okay? And so it's not, none of you want a mutation, okay? But some mutations can actually help an organism survive. Let's look at some of those. I have an evolution textbook at home, a few of them, and one of them the first 20 or 30 pages is all talking about antibiotic resistance. So antibiotic resistance is claimed to be evolution before our very eyes, evolution in action. So let's pretend that you have a stomach ulcer. Okay, that's what it looks like. Inside your stomach, you have mucus that protects your stomach from the hydrochloric acid that's inside your stomach and the enzyme pepsin, and when they come together to break down proteins. And this little guy here, Helicobacter pylori, we'll call him H. pylori for short. Now, he is a bacteria. Most bacteria in your stomach can't survive the harsh conditions, okay? It's hydrochloric acid, the pH is like 2 or 3. This guy, though, he can survive. And so if he does survive, assisted suicide, okay? You use something the organism has to kill it. Here's the problem with our situation currently. There's actually a mutant H. pylori, and he actually doesn't produce the enzyme. He lacks the ability. He's developed this mutation right where the enzyme would be produced, but it's not produced. So what happens? If you have no enzyme, you have no poison, and you have no death. So this guy survives. And he goes on and makes copies of himself through asexual reproduction, and you have a whole bunch of these guys, okay? And that's not good. And we got to come up with a new antibiotic to take him out. So, but notice what's happened here. Again, we knocked out an enzyme for him to survive. We didn't create an enzyme. We didn't create a new function. We didn't create some kind of micro machine that's going to do this. We actually broke something to make it happen. And I mean, this isn't the only way that you get antibiotic resistance. There's a number of ways. But I would argue every example I've read has been a loss of genetic information, not an increase. Okay? You're not going to go from molecules to man by going through this process, by breaking things. Here's a really powerful argument that I originally, when I originally discovered it, I thought, okay, this is it. This is the example of evolution in action, and what am I going to do? I got to become an evolutionist now. And then I started looking into it, okay? And I'm going to try and go through this example. This is Richard Lenski's experiment. Now, Richard Lenski has been doing a long-term evolution experiment. He started in 1988 with his bacteria. He's been growing them still till today, but as of 2010, he's had over 50,000 generations of bacteria. If we had 50,000 generations of human beings, that would be over 1 million years of human beings. So this is not a computer simulation. This is, we're growing bacteria in the laboratory and seeing if they'll evolve. Okay? So what happened? Well, there was a headline, and this is what startled me. E. coli, he's growing these E. coli bacteria. They're actually in your body as well. They evolved the ability to metabolize citrate. And to you that may not sound very exciting, but I thought, oh, they evolved the ability to do something. And it's metabolizing, like this is big. This is huge. Let's see what happened. So it turns out in an oxygen environment, aerobic conditions, the E. coli will not metabolize citrate. Now here's what they don't tell you in the article, if you go back and read Lenski's article. He won't tell you, at least not explicitly, that it has the ability to metabolize citrate, just not in this environment. If you go into a no oxygen environment, he can metabolize citrate. It turns out he can metabolize citrate in both, but what you need to do is get the citrate into the cell. Now here's the cool part. If you're in a no oxygen environment, you have a transporter, and he'll come and get the citrate and bring it into the cell. This guy doesn't have the transporter. That's the problem. He actually could metabolize citrate if he could just transport it into the cell. Now here's the cool part. He ended up getting a mutation that broke the citrate transporter. So instead of just working in this environment, it's working overtime. Now it's always making this transporter. And so what ends up happening is he's got the transporter now, and he brings it into the cell. I realize that might have been too quick I know, even for me, I've read this over. So here's an illustration. This is the best I could come up with, okay? Here we have two night lights. Two night lights. Instead of no oxygen, I'm going to say no light. Instead of oxygen, I'm going to put light. Okay, let's turn the lights off. Hey, my night light comes on. You ever have one of these hall night lights? And you turn the lights out, and all of a sudden the light comes on? So it turns on in the absence of light. Now this guy over here, when my light's on, he's off, right? But what happens if something broke in here? Maybe a sensor broke. So now it's on all the time when my lights are on. Notice though, there wasn't any new function being produced. There wasn't, go back to the citrate example, everything was there. The ability to make the transporter, the ability to metabolize citrate. Now listen very carefully. This is 50,000 generations. This is equivalent to over 1 million years of evolution, and that's what we have. That's the best example. Okay? You need to understand this. That's 1 million years. When I start talking about whale evolution and they think it can happen in like 2-3 million years, and all the things that have to take place, it's not going to happen because this is our evidence. This actually shows the limits of Darwinism, not what it's capable of doing. Okay? In fact, Michael Behe's written a book called The Edge of Evolution. I saw Michael Behe talk in Toronto last week. If you don't know Michael Behe's work, he's kind of a weird theistic evolutionist, but his intelligent design work, Darwin's Black Box, Edge of Evolution, are pretty brilliant. So we turn the light on, and the light stays on, and wow. That's my illustration. So to go from a paramecium to people, that's my wife and brother, you need to actually increase genetic information. Here's paramecium. It has no information to make hair or eyes or lungs or anything else. If you're going to make these very complicated structures and systems, you need more information. We'll come back to that when we talk about intelligent design. Okay, so what are some other evidences for evolution? Well, the fossil record. Fossil record. When I talk to people about the fossil record, I want to go directly, as a strategy, to the Cambrian explosion. This is when 75 to 95% of all known animal phyla, all the animal body plans, vertebrates, invertebrates, and so on, all come into existence. In fact, and so maybe you're a young Earth creationist or not. It doesn't matter. You can use this argument because they believe, even if you don't, in the millions of years. Okay? And so what we find is, in about 5 to 10 million years, you have every body plan showing up in the fossil record. Okay? Now that is a geological instant when you consider the whole thing being 530 million years ago. Okay? So from 530 million years ago to 520 million years ago, you have all the major body plans. And we haven't discovered any new body plans. In fact, the ones that we discovered in here, some of them have gone extinct. So we have less in existence today. Okay? Here's the argument, though. If evolution is true, you would expect to see the fossils transitioning into these. But we go and we dig in the Precambrian rock, and we don't find the transitions. They're missing. It's like these just showed up in a geological instant. And notice, this is like the creation orchard of life, not like the tree of life. Even Richard Dawkins in The Blind Watchmaker says, it is as though they were just planted there without evolutionary history. Okay? And he actually goes on after that to say, and the creationists are going to quote mine me when I say this. And so here I am, using this quote. Because it's true. It really is true. And you could cite quote after quote showing that. So this is biology's Big Bang, if you want to call it that. All these creatures just showing up. Very powerful evidence against evolution for creation. This I don't think is strong evidence, but I just like to point it out that stasis in the fossil record is more common than any kind of transition or evolution. So organisms remain largely unchanged throughout their duration in the fossil record. Here's a coelacanth 400 million years ago, and here's a coelacanth at present, and they're virtually identical. This guy hasn't evolved or changed in 400 million years. Okay? It's one of those things that make you go, Okay? And so that's a coelacanth. We got a horseshoe crab 445 million years ago. There he is. And there he is today. Okay, virtually identical. Lamprey, 360 million years. Hasn't changed. Okay, so there's things that make you go, why haven't they changed in millions of years? The missing links. In Charles Darwin's book in 1859, he writes that this is actually the most obvious and gravest objection against, or that can be urged against my theory. See, in his day, I mean, geology and paleontology were, to be honest, just early new science, but they couldn't find the transitions that he proposed. And there should be millions and billions of transitions. Okay, it shouldn't be this needle in a haystack hunt. And he believed that. And so here's a quote. I know this is a little old, but David Rupp actually says that, he says, we are now about 120 years after Darwin, and our knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. Ironically, we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had at Darwin's time, because some of the ones that Darwin thought were good arguments actually have been thrown out. Okay, they don't use them anymore. I'll show you some that we don't want to use anymore. The late Stephen Jay Gould from Harvard, he's a paleontologist, he said the extreme rarity of the transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. Okay, this guy was definitely not a creationist, but he saw that there was a lot of transitions missing. He actually came up with his own modified version of evolution called punctuated equilibrium, where evolution works more in fits and starts than this transition. So Richard Dawkins, he's a slow and gradual evolutionist, and I would say, no, you're wrong, and Stephen Jay Gould would argue against him. Stephen Jay Gould, he believes it happens in jumps and starts, and I would say, no, you're wrong, and Richard Dawkins would argue against him, okay? I think they're both right in arguing against each other. So let's look at whale evolution. Whale evolution. Okay, so we have this guy here. He was discovered a while ago. I'm not going to go into all the nitty-gritty detail. I'm just going to show you a pretty powerful argument against whale evolution. Here we have Pakicetus. That's what they believe the original whales evolved from. Similar to like a tapir, or they used to think of like a wolf or something. The original diagrams of this, by the way, when they discovered the jaw, the artists, they get their imaginations going, and they drew him in the water, and he had flippers and everything. And turns out, no, he's got legs. He's a tetrapod, and so here we have Pakicetus. Over here, you have Basilosaurus. And so Basilosaurus is about the 40 million year mark. Pakicetus is around 53 million years, 50 million years, around there, okay? And then they started finding all these things they called transitions. So we have Ambulocetus around 49 million years ago. We have Remington Ocetus, not the Remington shaver. He's at 49 million years as well. So these two are kind of right about here. You have Rhodocetus at 47 million years. Okay, and so they're just, wow, we're really finding evolution here. Now I could go through and show how these actually aren't good transitions. But here's what I'm going to show you. Recent evidence, okay? And this is where evidence really, like real scientific evidence, can just knock out a paradigm, okay? And recent evidence has discovered a fully aquatic whale jaw at 49 million years. So here we used to think this was our first aquatic animal, fully aquatic. Here we have these transitions, but only a million years after Pakicetus, or a couple million years after Pakicetus, we have a fully aquatic organism, okay? So these can't be transitions, okay? It has to be, the transitions have to be on this side, before the aquatic organism, okay? And so this is powerful evidence against all of these transitions. In fact, that means that to go from Pakicetus to a fully aquatic whale in about 3 million years, maybe 1 or 2 million years, in fact, you have to get, the blowhole You got to reduce the hind limbs. You got to go from the ability to drink seawater or adapt that ability, so change the kidneys. You got to build a tail fluke. You got to go from a tail that goes side to side to up and down. I've listed on my thing here, you can't see them, but there's probably 30 things that need to change to go from this guy to this guy. And as we saw, in 1 million years worth of time, 50,000 generations in Lenski's experiment, we saw minor change. But you're expecting to go from this to a fully aquatic whale in 2, 3, 4 million years? That, to me, is a huge extrapolation that just does not fit with the evidence, okay? Tetrapod evolution. We have a number of transitions. Euthen, Opteron, Pandrit, I'm not even going to try and say that one. These are around 380 million years ago. And then we have Ichthyostega and Acanthostega. They're around 365. And what they did, and if you search any evolution textbook that's been written in the last 5 or 6 years, they will all have Tiktaalik right in between. They said this is the perfect transition for evolution. You creationists want evidence? Here's the evidence. Here you have Tiktaalik, who is becoming a tetrapod. A tetrapod is a 4-footed creature. Basically, this is the evolution that takes a fish out of the water and puts him on land, able to walk around. And so here's the fish, here's the tetrapods, here's the intermediate. Here's the problem. They recently discovered in 2010 in Poland, I think it was Poland, fossil evidence of a tetrapod, and they have the walking, even the toes, they can count the number of toes. They found this at 397 million years ago. But here's the problem again. You have the evidence for a full tetrapod before all the transitions. This is all backwards. They would have never expected this. So Tiktaalik cannot be a transitional form because we already have the footprints. It's just a matter of time before they find the organism that made the footprints. Okay? So again, this is 2010. My textbook, that I'm using in biology class at my high school, still has Tiktaalik as one of the prime showcase evidences. Hey, look, the time scale matches perfectly. 10 million years between these two. Just perfect. But they don't mention the fact that we've actually found footprints even older. Okay? So this can't be a transition. Let's talk about the argument for design. So we've looked at arguments against evolution, but is there any arguments that we could make for design? Well, is there design in nature? According to some biologists, yeah. Many biologists admit that living things appear to have been carefully and artfully designed. Richard Dawkins, page 1 of his Blind Watchmaker, says, biology is the study of complex things that appear to have been designed for a purpose. Okay? This is right from the beginning. So now going back to our discussion about theistic evolution, this came to me the other night, and I just want to throw it in. The atheist says that things appear designed but aren't designed. That's Dawkins' view. Now this is a picture of Francis Collins, and he's a theistic evolutionist. He actually argues in his book that things appear undesigned. In fact, I've read his book, The Language of God, and he makes the argument for junk DNA, and he says, no God who creates life would put junk in an organism. Junk DNA is evidence for evolution, not for intelligent design. Now, Francis Collins needs to recant what he said because the ENCODE project, which was this huge project by numerous universities, numerous biologists, has come out and said, you know all that junk DNA, the 95%, 98% junk in our genome? Turns out it doesn't code for proteins, and that's why I thought it was junk, but it actually has all these regulatory functions. It's turning things on and off. And so they say 80+% could have function. which is wild. We'll just have to wait and see what other evidence comes out. But I say they're both right. Things appear designed because they really are designed. The Apostle Paul said, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, the eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen," appear to be designed, clearly seen. This is not, you don't have to, it's not a guessing game, being understood by what was made. So he actually did make it. So it's really designed, okay? So I would argue that Paul would say things appear designed because they really are designed, okay? So how do you make a design argument? If you drive across the Black Hills of North Dakota, you'll find this rock formation, okay? Now that didn't come from wind and erosion over millions of years. That was an intelligently designed process. And the way you know that is because those faces fit a certain pattern for presidents, okay? Now you could go to the Grand Canyon and see, yeah, this doesn't appear designed, okay? Looks like probably wind and erosion and everything else. A lot of water over a little bit of time, or a little bit of water over a long period of time, depending on your view. Carved this canyon. Now, not all rock formations are that easy to decipher, which is which. For instance, the Old Man in the Mountain. Okay, this is located in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. It resembles, look at the side profile here. It resembles an old man's face in the mountain. But nobody carved this, okay? Nobody was up there chiseling away. That's from, literally, it's from wind and erosion. And they're actually trying to preserve it now, so there's up there trying to, put scaffolding and stuff so it doesn't eventually wear right away. And then what if you were an archaeologist, you stumbled upon a pile of rocks, and they just looked like rocks. But then if you were really trained, you would say, hey, that's not a rock. That's actually an arrowhead or something like that. So there's these categories. I would put them like this. Appear designed, really are designed. Appear designed, but really is not designed. You also have appear undesigned. I mean, this appears designed right here, but if you had it in a big mound, it would appear undesigned to the average Joe, but it really was designed. And then this final category where you have appears undesigned and it isn't designed. Okay? So we have these kind of categories of figuring this out. Now, in the biological realm, we're told that there is the appearance of design. How do you figure out if the appearance is real or not? Or it's real design or not? Well, a common result, distinguishing between which one is the answer, well, Francis Crick, co-discoverer of the DNA molecule, he says that biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see is not designed, but evolved. So, no. It just don't even consider that it was designed because it had to evolve. And that comes from a scientific naturalism philosophy, okay? It comes from naturalism, that nature is all there is, and that's all science is able to get at, is using this naturalistic philosophy. Carl Sagan said the cosmos is all there is, all there was, and all there ever will be. Now, I had to throw this in. I do another talk on science and faith, but I had to throw this in because I'm sure some of you are maybe confused over what science is and what it isn't. When someone says intelligent design or creationism isn't science, they're not talking about the methodology. You see, science has a methodology, the scientific method. And intelligent design researchers are using the scientific method, whether you like it or not. I was at Michael Behe's talk, and this guy came up, and he was just, after the talk, he was so angry with Michael Behe that he could possibly be making a design argument. He said, how could you confuse all these people? Intelligent design is not science. But he wasn't talking about the methodology. He was talking about the philosophy. He was saying, no supernatural allowed. Only natural conclusions. And I give this illustration to people. I say, imagine that a well-known person is murdered in their house. The mayor's there, the chief of police. You're a forensic science detective. And the chief of police turns to you and says, this case is your top priority. I want you to use your best forensic methodology to find the killer. And so you're like, okay, I'm going to do it. And then you start walking. And then he says, oh, one more thing. You can't implicate a white man. Now, what question should kind of rise up in your mind? What if a white man did it? You see, naturalism is actually excluding conclusions a priori, before the evidence. okay? That's what's going on in our culture. Everyone thinks that scientists are just objective searchers of truth. I wish that were true, but it's not. And so we're fighting a battle against naturalism as Christians as well. So back to the story here. So so how do you test whether design is scientific? Well, there's a couple ways. We're going to look at irreducible complexity and specified complexity. Irreducible complexity. It was Charles Darwin who said that, he wrote in Origin of Species, if it could be demonstrated that a complex organ existed which could not have possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. This is Darwin. Darwin was actually open to criticism a lot more than any evolutionist is today. Well, Michael Behe has actually taken him up on that. And in his book, Darwin's Black Box, he comes up with organisms that couldn't possibly have originated through numerous successive slight modifications. He comes up with this idea of irreducible complexity. I'll just summarize it because I want to make sure I get through all this and I want to be sensitive to your time here. He basically says that organisms, different features of organisms, not everything, is intelligently designed, and some of those things are irreducibly complex. He compares them to a mousetrap. And he says, if all the parts aren't there, if all these parts aren't there, this thing won't catch a mouse if you're missing something. So all the parts have to be there at the beginning. If you have 2 parts, it's not going to catch the mouse. 3, no. And the way evolution works is it uses, the thing has to be, if it doesn't, can't use it, it's going to lose it, okay? And so you're not going to keep these things if it's not advantageous to the organism. One of those things he looks at is the bacterial flagellum. It's like an outboard motor on a bacteria. Those E. coli have a flagellum. It's a tail. Some have multiple flagellums. And these things turn. Now, this organism, this little micro machine, it turns at about 100,000 RPM. Okay? Can stop on a dime and turn the other way. That's about 1,600 revolutions per second. It's made up of 40 proteins. When they saw this is with an electron microscope. When they first saw this thing, they were like blown away. Because this is a little machine inside this organism. And it needs all 40 parts to work in concert to spin and move the organism. Okay? Oh, by the way, Richard Lenski, remember his experiment? Some of those organisms lost their tail. And that's because he was putting them in the food. They didn't have to move around for it. They could just sit there and eat without moving around. And so that was another thing. They evolved the ability to lose their tail. Again, they lost something. So that was another thing, not very convincing. It has all of these things, a stator, a rotor. It has bushings, a hook, all of these things. 40 protein parts. And there's no way to explain this. And what they've done is, they've taken this thing and they've taken one of the protein parts away. It's called reverse engineering. You take one away, does it function? No. Okay, let's take this one away. And it doesn't work? Okay, let's try again. It's a knockout experiment, reverse engineering. Okay? This is the way you could test design. And they pointed, we can talk about this, bacterial flagellum more in the Q&A if you guys have questions about it. Specified complexity. Turns out in our DNA we have what's called specified complexity. You guys use a design inference all the time. And let me show you an example. This license plate has specified complexity, okay? Or sorry, has complexity. This license plate here has specified complexity. Imagine on my birthday, I'm given a car, okay? My wife buys me a car. Maybe it's an old Galaxy, 60 whatever. And Ford Galaxy. And it says, the license plate says TIM, my name's Tim, and the year I was born, 1983, okay? Now, I could say, well, you know, someone had to get that license plate, and it's just lucky I did. Because it turns out the actual complexity, the probability of getting these 2 license plates is actually the same. You can calculate the probability, and it's about 1 in 167 million. Okay? Same probability. But here's the difference between complexity and specified complexity. Specified complexity fits an independently given pattern. So it would be ludicrous for me to say, well, all license plates are equally complex to get, and it just so happens I got this one by chance. No, I'd be crazy to say that. It's because it fits this pattern, okay? And so there's a difference between these two. And it turns out when you look at the DNA molecule, it has what we call specified complexity. Bill Gates, not a biologist, but he recognized it. He says, DNA is like a supercomputer. He understands software, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created. And a lot of these guys are comparing DNA to software now. The problem of the origin of life is clearly basically equivalent to the problem of the origin of biological information. They can't explain where life came from, and one of those reasons is because it has this information built into the system. So scientists have discovered that the DNA double helix structure is has specified complexity. What do I mean? Well, here we have the English language has a code system. It has 26 letters in its alphabet. The DNA molecule actually has its own code system, okay? Made up of nucleotide bases, which we give the letters G, C, A, T, okay? So just like this has A to Z, this has a 4-letter alphabet. And when you put these letters in order, in a certain order, they actually spell out, there's a codon here, every 3. And that's going to code for amino acids, and amino acids codes for protein. If you don't know this, take biology. You guys need to. This is really cool stuff. And so, like, my kids are loving it at school right now. And and if you actually move one of these letters, you delete it, like a point mutation, a deletion, or you insert a letter, or if you delete a whole section, then you screw up the whole thing. Okay, this is bad news. This is what mutations do. So you could imagine an article in a newspaper, someone just putting a letter in at some point. And the meaning gets kind of screwed up. But you and your brain, you're using, okay, they made a mistake here. And so that's what mutations do. And so it turns out there's specified complexity, a certain pattern here that's necessary for life. So that's the specified complexity argument. Again, you could spend a whole hour talking about that. The objections to design turn out to be not scientific. The objections to design turn out to be theological, that theistic evolutionists have raised. And I came up with some slides about this, but I'll just show you this for now because I want to finish up here. They'll say things like, well, the designer, there couldn't be a designer because there's such poor design in nature. You know, the pharynx at the back of the throat, it's right next to, there's one tube that goes into 2. There's the epiglottis, which kind of divides the two tubes. One's called your esophagus, one's your trachea. You don't want any food to go into your trachea. That's what you breathe through. And so they say, oh, this is terrible design. People could choke. They'll say things like, oh, have you ever heard of an ectopic pregnancy where the embryo lodges itself or starts to develop inside the fallopian tube? See, terrible design. This stuff happens. There should be a better way to do it. The eyeball, Richard Dawkins in his book talks about how the eye is just terrible design. So they give you these arguments against the designer because of what they think is poor design. Now, what I'm arguing here is the design inference doesn't say anything about the creator. In fact, bad design is still design, right? Just because there's a terrible, like, my phone has been acting up, this Android Samsung. And I'm getting really ticked. Like, I almost threw the thing in the garbage today. And it's still designed, even though it's terribly designed compared to an iPhone, okay? And so you could compare things. And we could go into that if you want to in the Q&A. Evil design as well. They'll say, look at all these evil features. And I mean, you could argue a number of different ways against this. But again, I would argue that evil design is still design. Okay? Even though you want to argue against the creator, it's not a scientific argument against intelligent design. All right. So in about 10 minutes, if you can hold on, I want to give a basic theological argument against, and you could, honestly, I could have spent an hour and 2 hours doing this. So I'm going to focus, I'm not going to talk about the days of Genesis, which I could. I'm interpreting those and going through that to argue against theistic evolution. My beef is with Adam, okay? And Carl Giberson, in his book, he says, the Genesis story of creation loses all contact with the natural world and starts to look strangely like an old-fashioned fairy tale that might teach a lesson but certainly makes no claims to historicity. He goes on, I began to wonder how an old story about a guy named man in a magical garden who had a mate named woman made from one of his ribs could ever be mistaken as actual history. Okay? Now, I take exception with this because I think there actually was a man named Adam. I think the Bible actually teaches that. For one, the genealogies in the Bible seem to suggest that Adam was a historical person. I'm not going to read these, but you could look at Genesis 5, which is there. Adam is connected. You have 1 Chronicles 1, Adam, Seth, Enoch, and so on. Luke 3, the New Testament, you have Jesus' lineage being traced all the way back to Adam. And listen, you don't need a PhD in biology or genetics to know that you can't be descended from a metaphor, okay? You have to be descended from a human being. And so I take exception for that reason. You could also put Jude 1:14 treats Adam as a real person. Behold, it says it's a seventh from Adam. Okay, and if you go through and count the generations back, hey, it is the seventh from Adam. He was the seventh from Adam. Finally, I would say that Jesus treats Adam and Eve as a real people. Mark 10:6-9 says, "But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but one. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." I would also argue the problem is even worse because without a historical Adam, there's no historical fall. If there's no historical fall, there's no original sin. If there's no original sin, then there's no need for a redeemer. Okay? You see the logic of that? Listen to Paul's words in his argument, not mine. He says, "Therefore, just as one trespass led to the condemnation of all men," one trespass. Which trespass was that? "So one act of righteousness leads to the justification and life for all men. For as by one man's disobedience the many were made sinners." One man's disobedience. And so the one man's obedience, the many will be made righteous. We have Paul making a very simple argument comparing Adam to Jesus. Okay, one man and one man. He's referring to Adam as a real person. Notice the argument is about the overthrow of the one sin of the one man by the one salvation of the one man. Okay? A metaphorical Adam and a metaphorical fall would not require a historical atonement. Only a mythical atonement is necessary for a mythical fall. No, Paul argues that the historical solution is required because we have a historical problem. Okay? You might be thinking, well, where did these theistic evolutionists think sin came from? I thought that, so I went digging through their books. Carl Giberson, he says sin comes from this place. He says, he argues that sin was there in human beings from the very beginning. Selfishness, he says, drives the evolutionary process. Unselfish creatures died, and their unselfish genes perished with them. Selfish creatures who attended to their own needs for food, power, sex, flourished and passed their genes onto their offspring. After many generations of selfishness, selfishness was so fully programmed into our genomes that it was a significant part of what we now call human nature. Okay, so he says it's always been there from the beginning. There was no point where there was no sin. in any organism, okay? But the Bible teaches that, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, there was a point where sin did not exist, but yet it came into the world. It can't come into the world if it was always in the world. It comes into the world through one man, and death through sin, that's why we die. And so death spread to all men because all have sinned. That's Romans 5:12. 1 Corinthians 15:21-22 says, "For as by a man came death," that's Adam he's speaking of, "by a man has come also the resurrection of the dead." That's Jesus. "For as in Adam all die." You want to know why you die? It's because of Adam, and you have that same sin nature. "So also in Christ shall all be made alive." And the reason you will have eternal life, if you put your faith and trust in Jesus Christ, is because of what Christ has done. There's two histories of death, I believe, that are portrayed here. One is where you have no death, and man's sin brings death into the world. Okay? I don't know where you can ask me about my views on creation, but I lean more towards that there was no death, including animal death, before the fall. But, I mean, I could be persuaded the other way. And then, if you're a young earth creationist, you believe in thousands of years, but you could put millions of years. And death will be destroyed eventually, okay? So death is kind of shows up. It's called an enemy, an intruder. It's going to be done away with. It's a temporary part of history. The problem is, that in contrast, we have death. By Carl Giberson's own words, death and sin have been in the world since the beginning. In fact, that's how evolution works. You don't have natural selection without certain organisms dying off and other organisms surviving. And so death is a permanent part of history. And as far as we can tell, just by looking at the process, it doesn't look like it's going to be done away with. Of course, the Bible says it is. So here we have man's actions bring sin and death into the world, whereas you have death brings man into the world. Okay? So man brings death, death brings man. Kind of polar opposites. You could also argue that the creation was very good, and depends on your view of creation again, but on theistic evolution, it doesn't appear very good in the sense of what the author of Genesis was saying. And finally, I would say that the wages of sin, the penalty for sin, is death. But the gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus. The last enemy to be destroyed will be death. I don't see death as being this good thing. In fact, on a theistic evolution view, we're still evolving. Organisms are still evolving. So the work of creation is not done. The work of creation is still in process. But we could develop an argument where the Bible, I think, teaches that the creative process is done. Of course, God upholds this creation and sustains it, but his creating work is done. And I don't see that as compatible with theistic evolution. So these are a couple problems, theological problems. Again, probably the main reason that I don't hold to evolution is because I don't think there's a scientific evidence for it. But I think that, again, the theological argument, the logical problem, just add to the case. Okay? It's a cumulative case that I'm making here today. And so, going back to my original question, are evolution and Christianity compatible? In my opinion, and I'm trying to be open-minded, but in my opinion, the evidence suggests that they're not. Okay? So, I guess we could open it up to questions at this point. You know, I went 68 minutes, so don't look at that clock, which is not too bad, considering I took out like 20 slides from what I created this week. I didn't talk about homology, which is a huge argument in the textbook as well, but we'll leave it there.
4 questions and answers.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, let's hear it.